Today, today we'll be joined by three API security experts at all levels of business and all levels of experience. And we'll bust a few myths, discuss what really matters with API strategy and API traffic, and help you gain an understanding of how to mitigate cybersecurity.
Roy, are you muted?
I'm glad somebody else asked.
So we'll start again. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar with Resurface, the art of API security, what CISOs need to know. Today, we'll bust a few myths and discuss what really matters when it comes to API strategy and API traffic, and to really help you mitigate those cybersecurity threats. We'll start by introducing our panel, and I'll say the boring bio stuff, and I'll ask each one of Matt, Barb, and Rob to give us one interesting fact about yourself. So we'll start with Matt. Matt Konda, founder of Jemurai and securityprogram.io, former OWASP board member, and one of those rare COBOL programmers that you hear about in myth and legend, but maybe hard to find today. Matt, tell us about yourself.
Thanks for the introduction. I'm a little bit scared of the COBOL comment, and thanks for having me here. So I think the surprising fact I'd share is that Konda is a last name from India, and I took it from my wife when we got married.
Interesting. Oh, that's actually really interesting. We'll have to talk about that later. Next, we'll move to Barb MacLean, VP of Integration and Analytics at Celero, helping to bring secure and integrated digital solutions to credit unions. If that wasn't impressive enough, Barb is also the founder and creator of the FinTech Playlist and prefers to start Uno games with Fibonacci sequences. Barb, tell us about yourself.
So I think my fun fact is that I used to read the dictionary as a child, so probably explains where some of the Swirtle fascination is coming for me on Twitter lately.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. For those who don't know, Swirtle is a Star Wars variation of the popular game Wordle. So thanks, Barb. And then we also have Rob Dickinson, co-founder and CTO of Resurface Labs, formerly of Intel, Dell, and Crest Software, and all-around believer in customer empathy equals customer success. Rob, do you have an interesting fact?
I'm something of an amateur musician, and so as part of getting myself through the pandemic, I decided to pick up the drums, which I've always wanted to do, and kind of never felt like I've had the opportunity to do that before. And it's been super fun and super way to you just get out your frustrations physically, like being cooped up and or whatever. You can imagine your API attackers and you're hitting them on the head or whatever. It feels very very therapeutic.
We could certainly use a lot of that these days, Rob. So that's good to know. So just a few things for the audience. Number one, we want to make this as interactive and useful for you as possible. So by all means, feel free to ask any questions or provide any comments in the chat, and we'll try to reflect them back so everyone can hear. And of course, this webinar is being recorded, and then we will share the link to the recording after the webinar is complete. So let's get right into it. So one of the first things that I think would help everyone kind of understand where we are today is to kind of take a look at the past and say, okay, what are some outdated security assumptions that still lead to what practitioners are preaching and even doing today, and in today's super connected, super complex world. What are some things that we need to move past in terms of API security? And I'll open up to the panel, but we'll start with Matt.
I mean, where do we start? I think your firewall is your moat is a idea that is clearly outdated. Although I will say watching egress in a firewall is certainly important. I think the focus on application level vulnerabilities is certainly something that needs more attention, and it's been one of the reasons I spent a lot of time at OWASP working with application security. And now every application is composed of APIs, so APIs become part of that discussion. Another one that I would pull in is that your signal, like your security signal in your SIM, is solid. So I think that's a false assumption for most companies, because most people don't have all of their applications logging to their SIM. And when they do turn that on, often they end up stopping because there's so much noise produced by the application. So there's not really an effective way to do threat hunting or exploration based on application information. Another thing that I think people don't always think about is that you may have an application and you may have an API, and your application may use parts of your API, but it probably doesn't use your whole API. So you may have parts of your API that are built for management functions or something like that, and your scanners are not going to detect those. And so I just kind of put that out there as food for thought. Like, can you see what's happening with your APIs and your applications? Can you scan them? And just understanding what you have with your APIs seems like a thing that we just don't, as an industry, really have a handle on.
Yeah, so it really comes down to like visibility and knowing what's going on with your APIs. And maybe Barb, because you're responsible for overall strategy and deployment of APIs for fairly significant businesses and credit unions and fintech. From your perspective, how does that apply? From what happened in the past to what should be happening now?
I think the overarching assumption that the breach is not going to happen to you, or hasn't already happened to you, is one we need to get past. This is a problem we all have. And for us, we've tried to take that mind shift to assume breach at all times. And what does that posture then bring you? And what activity and behavior does that then drive within your teams and the people that are building the solutions with you and for you? So to me, that's one of the fundamental changes in thinking. And not hiding your head in the sand and assuming it's not going to happen to you, because it probably already has, and it definitely will again.
Yeah, and that maybe leads to kind of a popular term today, which is zero trust, right? Zero trust security, and how it applies to APIs. So, Rob, is there an applicability of zero trust to APIs?
Absolutely. I mean, a huge part of what Barb was just alluding to was the fact that these public environments where your APIs are running are incredibly hostile environments, especially compared to what web properties used to look like a decade ago. So you have to step back from that thinking of saying we're in the construction phase, we're focused on our functionality, we're focused on getting traction, we're focused on getting those early customers. I mean, we've run experiments ourselves where we'll put a new endpoint up on AWS, a new endpoint up on Azure, a new endpoint up on GCP, and you can see that endpoint is being scanned and probed and attacked within minutes, right? And that's before you've run your first ad, before you've had your first customer sign up or do anything like that. So really the need for security, once you get your head around that idea of how incredibly hostile these environments are, it's kind of like if you're going to go to Venus or you're going to go to Mars or you're going to go to the bottom of the ocean, that you need significant protection to do that. And I think that's a level of awareness. It feels easy just to go out on AWS and Azure and deploy some new endpoints and try some stuff out. But really, I think we underestimate how hostile those environments really are.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into kind of the next thing. So we ran a survey with registrants for the webinar and on social media, asking people, different questions about API and API security. And one of the interesting results, or maybe dichotomies, and this is for you, Barb, is that we saw over 60% of the respondents said that APIs are either very important or extremely important, yet less than 50% said that prioritizing security is months, if not years out. And then Barb, from your perspective, how do companies overcome that kind of, yes, we think APIs are important, but then we don't really want to start our API security program immediately?
I think for us, people have very much aligned to the idea that there's a platform business model to be had in the promised land of APIs. And that's why that concept resonates with them on, yes, I know this is important to me, whether it's the APIs that I know that I have, or I don't know that I have, and I need to figure that out, or I need to partner with someone that's going to help me on that journey it's the beautiful, digital transformation thing that organizations are going through. I think there's then this false assumption that an easily digestible API means that the person that made it easy to use was also thinking about how to deploy and manage and update it and keep it secure for you. I think people just don't understand the fact that it can be beautiful and easy to use or well documented, but not necessarily able to be deployed or used in a secure way. I think that's the disconnect. The topic and depth and breadth of the knowledge that you need to have in the people that care about security, I think is part of the problem, right? It's a bit of an abstract concept too. It's a tough one, I think, for business owners to really understand. So when you don't have that understanding, it's probably also quite easy to kick that can down the road for someone else.
I also think there's a risk angle to all of that. So prioritizing your security work is one of the most important things you can do, because you can't do everything. And I think, kind of riffing off what Rob just said about it, it's a hostile environment out there. It's hostile in different ways for different applications, which means you have different indications for what work you should do. So if you're building an API that lets you transfer money, you absolutely need to watch what's happening on that. It feels like I shouldn't even have to say that. But if you're building an API that serves animated GIFs, maybe you don't need to watch that so closely, right? And broadly speaking, I would say all of our security activities should be informed by risk. And I think that API is sort of just coming to the table as part of what we're thinking about as our attack surface and something to think about risk for. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and Rob, did you have something to add, or?
No, I mean, I can't improve on that.
No, that's good. And again, continuing on that thread, Matt, there's hostile environments, risk levels, people's comfort levels, and we all know that we work with different types of people who respond to security and the concept of security in different ways. So we have, there's a spectrum of people who are sort of passionate about compliance, but they're nervous about making real change. So how do we bridge that gap between checking checkboxes on a checklist versus real action?
I think you stole that from me, because I always am the one who said I have people who have a passion for compliance, and it's sort of a closet. It's not really an insult, but it's for people who are super serious about security. Having a passion for compliance means that maybe you don't understand security, and I don't mean that as a negative thing to anyone. But compliance is really important and has had a good effect for in a lot of industries. Take PCI, for instance. When I started in the security industry, we worked in PCI. And it has very specific things you need to do to meet the standard, which made everybody do them, which protected your credit cards, right? Were they perfect? Was it a perfect standard? No, but you had to do those things to be PCI compliant to process credit cards. And it, broadly speaking, systemically helped a lot of people. So I make fun of compliance, but I don't really mean to be making fun of compliance, right? It has had a major positive impacts. But in the context of thinking about change and evolution and security, you have to assume in a way that compliance is maybe a step behind, right? Like a WAF is a 10-year-old tool. PCI said you have to have a WAF or a pen test, right? So now everybody's doing a WAF or a pen test. That doesn't really mean you're doing all the right things for security now. So when you present a focus on compliance, my sort of challenge back is, again, focused on risk. It's great to have, I think eventually APIs will be covered by some kind of compliance regime, depending on maybe a vertical or an industry or something like that. In fact, arguably they already are. But the question is, what tooling and analysis and testing and security measures are required for APIs? And like a lot of things in security, it's complicated.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, and that's Rob and Barb, from a practical execution perspective, is there anything out there that can be? Is there any compliance, a standard or process or checklist out there that can actually apply to a very specific environment?
One of the implementation paths that we have found is, the tools that the large public cloud providers are arguably better than anything that any individual organization might choose to build themselves. The reality is that Microsoft, as an example, spends 20 billion with a B dollars on cybersecurity. My team just does not have that amount of money. So, you need to pick your spots and pick your battles and pick your partners wisely. I think there's a lot of, I don't want to sort of leave anybody with the impression that it's only the big tech that can do this well. That's also not what I'm saying. But, you probably do need to follow the path of people that are choosing to invest in these areas. Maybe it's that you're going to choose to invest there yourself, right? That is a decision path you can take. But we have found a lot of value in tools that others are building. Microsoft would be one example for us. And, picking an example, out of the air, we can very easily show compliance, sort of what, Matt is talking about on compliance can drive activity for you as long as you're doing it in the right way. We can very easily implement the initiatives and policies in an Azure environment that once enabled, for us, it's sort of like compliance as code. You actually then can't be out of compliance, at least for the scope of context that's there. So clearly we operate in a very highly regulated environment, and we regularly have to be able to prove that compliance. Does it cover all of the spectrum of topics of security for APIs that you need? It does not, but at least it allows you to continue down that, sort of circle of threat, zero trust environment that you're trying to craft on. At least here in this part of that concentric series of circles is where I'm helping to protect myself and my environment. And for us, of course, the protection we're trying to give ultimately is to the account holders. That's whose data we hold in trust. And so it behooves us, to be going beyond in that respect.
Yeah, we could probably have a whole another webinar on, compliance theory versus practicality and reality and things like that. That's another point that's interesting, is that even before all this, thinking and strategy happens, Barb, you mentioned this before the session, is that often people don't think that they have APIs in the organization for whatever reason. Can you talk a little bit about, why that perception exists, and what are they missing when they say that?
I think it probably comes from the idea that if you don't have a fancy RESTful or GraphQL JSON file that you're handling, that you don't have an API. The reality is that APIs have existed probably longer than I've been in my professional career then. And so I think people are getting trapped in definition and semantics there, and not understanding that fundamentally we're talking about how applications move information and data between themselves. And that's clearly been happening for a very long time. So it is one of those myths that I think people need to, again, open their minds a bit and just sort of shift their perspectives on. If you think you're not doing it, you absolutely are.
I'm kind of laughing because I'm thinking about 20 years ago, an application that we worked on that scraped websites to effectively build what is an API, but it was scraping websites. So if you have a website, you have an API. And almost certainly if you have a mobile application, you have an API, right? Unless your app just runs by itself, it's a game and it doesn't talk to anything, you have an API. So yeah, I think it's, now of course, I think it's also important to mention there's like an explosion of APIs, because what you have is you have your front gateway, and then behind that you have microservices, each one of which is a small API, right? So now we're building an API for this, an API for that, an API for that, and we're composing applications out of them in many cases. But yeah, it's possible that you don't have an API, but most probably you do.
Yeah, it's like an evolution of that. Is it Mark Andreessen's that code? The software will eat the world. Now it's APIs are eating the world. So yeah, and then Rob, from your perspective, because you have a lot of experience, obviously supporting and maintaining and securing APIs. Have you ever, worked with a customer or someone who's surprised at something that you found?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's the common theme. I didn't know we had that. I didn't know we were doing that. I didn't know we were vulnerable that way. I just had no idea that users or attackers would show up that way. Are all kind of the things that we hear over and over. And the thing is, what I think is really encouraging though is where you can kind of flip the script on that a little bit. And this really goes with what Barb was saying earlier. Like, Barb, correct me if I'm speaking out of turn for you, but I think part of what I heard you talking about was really like institutionalizing, creating KPIs that are positive, net positive signals that relate to better security. So you're not just measuring performance, you're not just measuring availability, you're not just measuring obviously your financial KPIs, but you're including security as an ongoing part. And I think because that in itself, I mean, you may not have control about how much budget you can put towards security, like you may have other constraints, but you certainly can control how your reaction as an org is that, you know, when you find a new kind of security issue or something that needs to be remediated, is that met with a groan, or is that met with enthusiasm that now you're going to be in a better place for having that knowledge? And that, I mean, we have 100% control over that. So it's part of it is having the visibility and the understanding that these APIs are there. And part of what's hard about that is that we just can't see them. You know, with the web world that we had before, you could go and visit the website, you could see it yourself. It's really hard when you're using a software agent to understand how many different services that thing is connecting to. But then there's that question of, well, once you have that visibility, what are you really going to do with it? And how you greet that emotionally in your organization, I think, is just such a huge tell about how you're successful those programs will be.
I wonder if, Matt, that was maybe what you were trying to get at earlier with, you know, who's passionate about what topic. You probably either need to have those people in your team, or you need to be able to align to another team and organization that is, because mindset is so important, right? There's all the tools and technologies in the world that you can bring to bear here to help you. But if you don't have the right mindset of the people that, you know, have some responsibility, you're tasking to work on those things, you're setting yourself up for failure for sure. And absolutely, Rob, totally agree, right? This is, I think, how people can bridge that dichotomy gap on, I care about APIs, but I'm not going to prioritize security. How do you prove the ROI of that in the business? Some of those tips that you're giving us here are I think, good there. And organizations do have to be aware of their risk tolerance and, you know, what they can afford to spend, right? Nobody has unlimited budgets or capabilities to bring to bear. And you do have to balance that. I can afford to protect myself like this because it fundamentally at some point does come up against that, you know, capacity funding constraint that everyone has. And you have to be aware of the trade-offs of those decisions that you're making.
Yeah, I'm going to actually pick on a couple of threads that you said there. So we have compliance, we have mindset, and Rob, you mentioned the magic word, or maybe the trigger word, depending on how you interpret it, KPIs. So what can anyone give me an example of? Okay, this is a KPI. How do you sell it, and how do you execute on it? And that's anyone can answer.
One I'm happy to talk about from inside our organization is we pay attention to it for ourselves, but we also pay attention to it for the ecosystem that we're responsible for, because you know, we hold and trust all of this data on behalf of, you know, more than 1 million Canadians. And in that concentric circle of stakeholders, we also then work with a number of financial institutions and credit unions. And so, you know, they give us the responsibility, and that's the responsibility we're happy to care and own about doing that in the appropriate way and securing that in the appropriate way. And so we have very clearly gone on a journey of, let's use, you know, kind of the security maturity scoring system. It's something that, whether you're deeply into this space or not, it gives everyone, either from the business or technical side, not only inside our organization, but amongst all of the stakeholders that care deeply about what we do, something that they can all understand. You know, clearly the desire would be, in the trade-off decisions that you're making, to get as high on that maturity curve as you can. And so that's one example for us that has really resonated, because regardless of how deep you are or how technical you are or not, it's something that you can understand.
Some things that come to mind for me are like when I think of KPIs, I like to think of things that are very measurable, like there's a number. So how many endpoints do you have exposed is like, that's not a KPI because it's just a measure. But the goal of having, let's say 100% of those have tests that indicate that you don't have some type of, let's say privilege escalation is a common thing that we find with APIs, right? So you have specifically a test for privilege escalation for every API endpoint. That would be a goal that you can now measure because you know how many different endpoints you have and you know whether you have that test or not. There are a lot of softer KPIs, things around like security training for developers who are building APIs. Things like being able to know how many actual incidents you had. I know nobody wants to talk about the incidents they'd have, but like actually knowing that should be some of your most important feedback into what you do. If you're thinking about your risk, how much you're being attacked now, whether it's an incident or just an attack, right? There's a lot of noise that isn't really an incident and you don't care about. But if you know how much of that you're getting, you know how much attention you're getting, you know probably whether it's all the same or whether it's changing, and a change would maybe drive you to invest differently. So those are the kinds of things that come to mind when I think about KPIs for API security. Certainly having a like red light, green light on, we have authentication on our APIs, like really basic, right? So you could start simple, or you could start with a richer measure. It probably depends on your maturity, kind of riffing off what Barb said.
One of the KPIs that we're trying to help with, specifically going back to the point that Matt made earlier about you can't really assume that your firewall is the perfect moat that you might like it to be. I think a lot of folks look at how much traffic is being blocked by the firewall, and then an estimation of what percentage of that are false positives. And there's a huge range of organizational appetite for risk there. Some folks have, will just let more of the attackers through, if that means not blocking any real customer. And so I think one of the KPIs that we hear a lot about is kind of that false positive rate in blocking. But one of the KPIs that we're really trying to drive as a product company is what are the false negatives. There are attackers that should have been blocked by that firewall that weren't. And that's because either the firewall wasn't configured to block those or chose not to, or it's because those attackers are actually using real user accounts. They're impersonating those users so perfectly that the firewall really can't tell the difference, and you're getting on the inside. In some cases, it's just as simple as you sign up as a paying customer and you use your existing customer credentials to escalate an attack to the rest of the organization. So anyway, just going back to that kind of moat idea, I mean, I think trying to establish even just some basic metrics at that level, who's getting blocked, who's being let in, how many folks are being let in are actually malicious, and being able to see that, like, there's a balance point that you're going to have to find there with respect to your organizational risk. And you've got to have those fine-grained measures, I think, to have a chance at that.
I think that's why the recognition that you're either inside or outside my castle wall is not the reality anymore, because how many stories have we all heard on it was actually an inside actor that caused the breach or exfiltrated the data. And that's why it's such just a false narrative that the moat protects you, because sometimes the biggest threats are inside.
Yeah, and that speaks to another concept we haven't touched on yet, but it's more how instantaneous and how real time do we want our measurements, our analysis, and our reporting and alerts. And we actually got a comment from Russ in the audience who said, "I'm on a journey to transform batch processes to REST APIs to support more real time availability of student data." So can anyone speak to kind of how important is the real timeliness of the data and the tooling that we're talking about here?
Well, your attackers move pretty fast. I mean, they're programmers too. They take what they're doing extremely seriously. They're organized, they're well-funded. I I mean, I don't know. I mean, honestly, as somebody that talks about this stuff and looks at this stuff a lot, I mean, every time I hear about a new case where it's like, oh, all of our health data will be officially available through these APIs, like part of it is like, awesome, there's all this cool stuff that's going to unlock, and there's all these new ways that we're going to be able to empower software agents to go out and consume these things. Because like, how many websites can I visit as a human and assemble all that information? Like, we're moving from a web that was designed for humans to share pictures to a web that's designed for machines to work together on our behalf. And but there's such a huge loss of control in that process, that, you know, that's the part where it's scary. So yeah, I think so. I, you know, I don't mean it in an alarmist way, but the real time aspect to that is so important, because you're thinking about your business cases in terms of that real time aspect, but your attackers are thinking exactly the same way. They can respond in real time as well.
I'm here to go against the grain, so I'm going to do that.
Good.
So Russ, I think it's a really interesting question. I think you may have, it depends a lot on how the batch process works, but you may be just as exposed with the batch process as you were with the API. A lot of batch processes work by moving files from S3 buckets to S3 buckets, or SFTP servers or something like that, right? And so if you have a big file with all the student data in it, the whole thing's going to get popped, right? If you have a REST API, you're calling hopefully one at a time. I think the thing that you want to think about, or what I would advocate thinking about, is really understanding your use cases so that you know who's allowed to ask for the record and what do you need to know about when they asked. Do you need to show that somebody asked for a record? Like, do you need to know who asked for Matt's record? Is that something you have to write to an audit log? Is Roy allowed to see Matt's record? Is Barb allowed to see Matt's record, right? Like, having a good story for that, I think, can help you build a better solution. And I think actually, I would argue you have an opportunity to make the REST API more secure than the batch process was. But I think I agree with Rob that you're exposed in the sense that there's people who are gonna, like, I once gave a talk where I was talking about comparing web application security and API security. And one of the things I said is, well, an API is just a faster way to get data out. If you're an attacker, it's a lot easier to pull all the data out of a system. If you give me an API endpoint, I can use to do that. And so I think for you, maybe thinking about, would you see it? What are the right cases? What are the wrong cases? Would be a really nice thing to know as you go that journey.
So what I'm hearing is everyone stay tuned for the Matt versus Russ podcast. So it's good. That's a good segue now into kind of more real time, or not real use cases and what's going on with we know being bombarded with information about API security. So we have WAFs. We talked about that. We have SIMs. We have SOARs. And then, you know, this is for everyone. What are we missing with those types of tooling? What are we missing in terms of API security?
Vulnerability management platforms.
So say it again.
Vulnerability management platforms.
Vulnerability management. Okay, that's Patrick Clausen. Yeah. So does anyone want to speak to that?
I mean, I can speak to it. I feel bad. I've talked a lot, but I feel like on some level, we're looking at WAF as like a way to block traffic and we're trusting it, but WAFs are easily bypassed, right? So like people like me know that if you put a lot of stuff in a form, you can make the WAF not able to analyze the input, right? Or if I put it in a different encoding, or if I put, right, it's like a game of cat and mouse with WAFs. So yes, they're good, you should use them, but they're not perfect, right? SIMs are only as good as the data you put in them. So if you're trying to do like look for security events, you can only see them if the data is going there. And so, like to Russ's point, is the REST API for student data pushing data to the SIM? What data, right? Like, I don't know how much visibility you get that's meaningful from that. So I'd like to give the example of, and coming back to privilege escalation, right? Like if I'm a Matt user and I'm trying to become an admin, like a Roy user, like a WAF won't stop that. A SIM won't show you that it's happening, right? So there's like this blind spot around access control or privilege escalation or authorization. Those are all words that mean basically the same thing. And so if I could get to be a super admin and you don't ever know that, I feel like we're missing a big expectation of like, I want my system to be able to show me this. And it doesn't generally in our experience. We pen test a lot. And I would say almost half of the time we find some kind of privilege escalation.
The approach that we like to take there, it does very much center around that zero trust model. And the analogy I like to give is we don't live in castles with moats and walls anymore. We live in these modern urban jungles, and you never know who's coming into the office building at any given time. And you probably don't know who's using the elevator to get to what floor. And maybe you feel like you can control that. But I loved the analogy you gave there, Rob, earlier on. The web isn't for people to look at, cat pictures anymore. It's about all of the machines in the world that are talking to each other. And that's the approach that we take is, many ways, we the humans are the weakest links. So even if I can get through the front door of the office building, I land in a lobby and there's no directory. I don't even know what floor the thing might be on that I'm trying to visit. And then me, the human, I press the button on the elevator, but a human's not allowed to activate the elevator. And even if you could get inside the elevator, then it detects, the heat signature that a human's in there instead of a robot. We literally take the approach of removing the humans out of it wherever we can. So the folks that would, ordinarily have the highest privileges in our environment, whether that's architects or senior developers or whatever, we deliberately set in place the processes and controls to clean up that access long before it ever gets to production. And the humans have no privileges. And we then take an approach on, I need to break glass here because some emergency happens that I have to remediate in production. But those things are well crafted and controlled to be, time bound, dumped to the audit, right, and permissioned, for others. So, that zero trust model has made such a difference to us and how we approach our work. It goes back to what I think we're talking about very early on things have changed so much, and the tools and approaches that are, well known and good practice and proven to be the much better way, they're not actually hard to implement. And that's been, the observation of myself and my team is you can choose to go down this path, and it doesn't require millions of dollars of investment either to get you there.
Right. And so we talked about a lot of things here. Now let's sort of take some of these things to action: mindset, compliance, that moat, moat versus, the reality. We'll go roundtable now. What's one thing you would recommend to get started? Rob?
To get started with, sorry.
For improving API security and getting started on that kind of.
Oh, for just improving in general. I think one thing that is top of mind for almost every organization that we talk to is who are the people that are going to help drive that process. To Barb's point, you obviously need more people as you're creating more isolated but overlapping zones of coverage. But also there's a general problem that the number of APIs that are potentially vulnerable are exploding. But at the same time, we're not making a lot more API analysts and security analysts in any given year. And the folks you have here, I mean, these are leaders in these fields, and they're so close to it. Like, this is what these folks live and breathe all day long. These are rare creatures. like that experience takes a long time to build, and a lot of experience that goes with that. So you really have to seek out not just the right tools, but to Barb's point, like the right organizational processes, and making sure you have the right expertise and that you're not under-rotated on that. It is relatively easy to under-rotate, especially in the context of not having enough people to go around to really fill that role. And that's why we're trying to help. We think of our product kind of as an API analyst in a box. And that's really where it comes from, because you can say we'll collect all this data or we'll have these dashboards or whatever, but if you don't actually have the people to run those programs and figure out what that telemetry actually represents, you're going to have a hard time. So, you know, I think whatever you're thinking about APIs, and it's hard because they're invisible, you can't really see them. But just like Barb was saying, you have to really start by thinking about what does that mean to the organization? What's your tolerance of risk? What are the goals that you're really trying to accomplish with those? And make sure that you have the right folks there to guide you.
That's great, Rob. And Barb, any tips or advice?
You know, I think sometimes the blessing and the curse of how do you just get started truly is that just get started. Whether you think you need to start sort of big and broad on, I need to understand my strategy, or maybe I need to define my own risk tolerance and understand that in my organization, maybe that's the battle you pick first. Maybe it is what Rob's saying. I recognize I don't have the expertise internally, and I need to get the people with the knowledge and mindset that I'm seeking, and I'm either going to bring them in or I'm going to find the partner that can help bring that to me. Or, you know, maybe it's a very specific use case, right? I know that I'm going to go and tackle, I love Matt's, right? Do you even have authentication on your APIs? Maybe that's the thing that you don't know, and you better go and find out the answer to that question. But it does fundamentally pick something and start working on it.
Great. And Matt?
I'm having trouble picking one, so I'm sort of thinking about risk and visibility. So if you have, so from visibility, there's sort of two levels, right? There's, do you have an inventory of your APIs? And do you know what you can see around each API? And from a risk, there's also sort of two perspectives. Like, broadly speaking, what are the big picture risks to your organization? Like, are you going to lose money out of your API? Are you going to have fraud out of your API? Are you going to lose personal information and get fined out of your API? What's the actual risk associated with the inventory of APIs? And then in a more detailed level, like, how's that going to happen and can you see it? So tie the risk to the visibility. Can you see the thing that you're afraid of?
No, that's great. That's great. And, you know, thanks for the discussion, everyone. I think we're almost at our time here. So thank you, Barb, Rob, and Matt, for all your wonderful thoughts and discussions. And thanks for the audience for offering those stories as well. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, we will share this recording of the session for you to share with your friends and colleagues. And also, I believe we'll stay tuned for details on our upcoming episode in this API security series. So once again, thanks to our audience for joining, and thanks to Matt, Barb, and Rob for an excellent discussion. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Sure.
Fun.